Hi, everyone. We are here for the CMT and School Accommodations session. We're super excited about this because it's a very popular topic among the social groups, and we hear from a lot of patients and families trying to navigate the school system and trying to make that as smooth as possible for their kids living with CMT. So we're honored and excited to be speaking with H&F board member and community member and mother of a daughter living with CMT, Brooke Warren. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Stella. Thank you for having
Hi.
me.
Yeah, and we really honor the life experience of our families. We are not necessarily trained experts in the field, but when we live this day in and day out, there's so much value in our life experience, and we really wanted to share that today with your journey, Brooke. And also, she's going to be sharing a lot of helpful resources as well to continue the conversation and just get people in a better mindset and a little bit more confident about navigating the school system.
And I think patient to patient advocacy is the most important because I learned this through other moms who had gone through it, and I'm not the expert either, but I can just tell you kind of my lessons learned. And
Mhm.
one of the first ones is there are both documented and undocumented ways to deal with these IEPs and accommodations, and you really need to tackle both. We'll go into that. But the other one is what you said, which is like finding people like me who have been through it. And we might tell you the wrong thing, we might tell you the right thing, but it's finding people who have navigated it before you, whether at your
Right.
school or in your district. And so hopefully I can shed some light on what my experiences have been with Reagan, both early on and now. But it is really kind of not always finding the expert and definitely not paying for the expert, but literally asking other moms and dads who have gone through it, um, that can help you and be an advocate. That's number one.
Absolutely. Yeah, we want to empower everyone to take the next step that they need to. So
Yeah.
without
So
further
I'm honored
ado,
to be here today. So I
yeah.
will I'm going to just kind of talk about school and CMT accommodations. So I learned this along the way. My daughter Reagan, you can see from these pictures, is 13 now. She's been she's pretty severe form of CMT 1A. She also had congenital hip dysplasia and neuromuscular scoliosis. So she's been through 4 hip surgeries starting at 5.5, and she has also been through a spine surgery, a foot surgery, and is about to go through another foot surgery. So in dealing with the schools, I think of it 2 different ways. I think that there's kind of the baseline CMT need, and then there's
Mm,
often surgical or rehab needs that need to be further addressed. So
absolutely.
that's just a little bit of a baseline about Reagan. Reagan is in it's called a parentally placed private school. When you deal with the districts, they call it parentally placed private school. And so, and I'm navigating Texas. I've just moved to Texas, and I'm navigating Texas school districts, which, by the way, are totally different than New York City. So, which is where we were for 13 years. And so, I'm going to give great advice, but it's not specific to. You have to really
Right.
dig into your district, unfortunately. So here's Reagan. This is a picture of my then 11-year-old before her foot surgery in LA. The middle picture is a picture of us this past Christmas when we moved to Texas, and so that's awesome. And I think the one on the right's pretty good because that's one of her early pictures at school when her needs were actually totally different. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about first, actually, which is how to talk to teachers in the early years versus the later years. These are the key topics we're going to go over. We're going to talk about how to talk to teachers. I think that's the most important thing. And then there's about documenting the process, right? So how to request services, the role of an IEP, the difference between that and a 504, the evaluation process. We'll go through what's called, it's an important topic to know, related services is where you get your PT and OT services, which are most important for us. And what's that versus accommodations? We'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about assistive technology. And then it's going to be diving into your district is going to be kind of the answer. So let's get started. First of all, before school age. So when they're very young, everyone should look into early intervention in their state. It's a state run program. You contact, like literally Google early intervention to schedule an intake. They have to be delayed somehow, physically delayed. They delayed walking, delayed crawling, whatever it is. Start that early. That process happens in your home. They provide a physical, at least in New York, they provide a physical therapist and an occupational therapist in the home. So again, a lot of these programs are run by different states and different districts differently, but I think the program is federal, so they probably have it in your area, and those services are provided in the home before school starts. When you get into a school age child, it turns from early intervention to a different program, and that's when we talk about the IEP, which we'll get to in a minute. The first thing I really wanted to talk about was early years versus later years, and let's talk about the undocumented part of the process. So the process where you are the advocate for your child. I look at it in the early years as you are the advocate, and in the later years, you need to empower your child to be the advocate. So one of the things I learned very early on was to sit with the teachers every year. Every year, you got assigned a new teacher, reach out to them, hand them H&S link, which is really helpful to talk about what CMT is and what it isn't, and sit down and review every symptom with the teachers, one teacher, two teachers, the principal, whoever's involved in the care of your child day to day, the person actually interacting with your child, and to talk about how those symptoms present in your child. Double explain, triple explain that it's not cognitive, because when people hear disability, they don't understand. You're dealing with people that just don't understand, and you have to make it understand in their terms. So that's the one piece of advice I give to parents. And I was talking to a mother of a child who had dyslexia the other day, and we were talking about how to talk to her teachers about putting it in words they understand. So for CMT, how in the early years, this is an important way to think about it. My daughter is not, they'll look for social cues in the early years. So what will Reagan do? What would Reagan do? She would never sit in the circle until every kid was seated. She would always walk around the edge of the circle, right? She's not going to like dive into the middle. Is she socially awkward? Is she not following directions? No. So it's about talking about these very subtle things with the teacher so that they're not flagging your child as something else. She's not going to want to cross the street and hold hands with another student. She's going to want to hold hands with an adult because they are much more reliable in terms of movement, and she can rely on them for balance much more. Does that mean she's like socially a misfit? No. Like, so it's really communicating to the teachers what it means from their perspective and your child's perspective, and to use that conversation to whether it's documented or not. And this is easier in private schools than in public schools. In public schools, it definitely has to be documented. In private schools, you would have the same conversation and less has to be documented. But in both ways, you need to develop strategies, documented or not, that are specific to the school and your child. Elevator strategies, bathroom strategies, PE strategies for young kids, and we'll go into the older kids in a minute. And just really be like, I'm an open book. Open the lines of communication early and revisit and strategize often, because a solution that you have will not work sometimes. So an example of that is Reagan was feeling really put off by having to go up a flight of stairs. And she was in the middle of the line of students, and she was probably second grade. This was early years. And they were rushing her. And so I was like, that's easy. Just put her in the back of the line. Can you just put her in the back of the line? Let's strategize about this. We put her in the back of the line. Guess what happened? The little kid who opens the door, he's in charge of opening the door, was so afraid of being late, he'd slam it in her face. What did she think? She thinks everyone hates me. Like, so it's really about inventing it, reinventing it, re-strategizing, and it's very specific to your child and your school situation. So another thing that was really helpful for me in the younger years is if you can walk, especially for female teachers, if you can walk in 5-inch heels, then she can do it. Meaning when you think about field trips, when you think about how far she can walk to PE or whatever the changing of the guard is in school, it's like, if you can do it in 5-inch heels, then she can do it. Now that was specific to Reagan and that changed over time, but putting it in ways that they can understand, that burning feeling you get in the ball of your foot when you wear 5-inch heels. That's what she feels every day, and then explaining to them that like fatigue is real. You need to believe them. So the other component of this I want to pull away, Estella, is that you need to advocate for your child in a way that they feel that the teachers, principal, whoever the adult is, has their back.
Right.
So you want them to go up to the student and say, your mom has explained. In the early years, you may not have told your child about CMT, which is fine. So take this as you go on the kind of spectrum, but it's important that the students feel that they have the trust of the teachers to say, if I'm tired or I need to sit out, that they're not disappointing. And that the adult has told the child, depending on the age, that they know what's going on with them and that they have their back and that they can come to them at any time. Right. That's the level of communication that's helpful for your child. It's healthy for your child. And that's not necessarily something you'll get in the IEP, but that's something you should strive to get with every teacher every year. Those are some of the early years. That's when you're the advocate. In the later years, I recommend the same teacher with meeting with the teacher, but to involve the child.
Mm.
Usually that takes 2 meetings. Reagan's only in 7th grade, so it was never just her yet, I will say. It would always be a pre-meeting with me and then a meeting with her to strategize on what works and what doesn't work. But to figure out, what are the field trips? What are the overnight field trips? Can she go? Can she not go? How are they going to make it work? And to think about the whole year in context before you start. Opening up the lines of communication. So in the later years, you're going to find this PE and sports credit is a big deal in public and private schools. And it's like, so what are we going to do about that? So in Reagan's current school, we started out by they were going to have the coach provide physical therapy and strength training to her. And they were like, oh, no, that's a legal liability. So again, this is going to matter whether you're in a private school or a public school, because in a public school, your IEP will be implemented during the day. So she will be pulled out of PE for physical therapy most often. And in a private school, you're going to have to redo the PE credit, whether it's study hall or, she's cleaning up the gym, like whatever it is, but agree in advance so that it's not your child trying to advocate for themselves with the PE coach. I think I'm a big open person. So open lines of communication early and often, ensure that make sure they know that you don't always get it right. So you don't expect them to always get it right, but open communication is important. And involve your child and ensure that they are as independent as possible. That trust factor where as they get older, a teacher goes up to them and says, I understand. If I don't understand, please help me understand more. I have your back. Those are the 3 words you want them to have. And then I would say be ready for the social dynamics as the ages progress for the student. So one of Reagan's biggest challenges were no one ever chose to sit on the bench with her when she was injured or post-op. And I just remember thinking, God, I wish the playground ages were over and she would just like want to gossip with the girls. Like,
Yeah.
when does that start? So that playground ages, like you're going to have some social isolation, and we're going to talk about that in counseling, but be prepared for your child. If they don't talk about it, for your child to feel unchosen. And I can't tell you the number of conversations I had with Reagan about how they're just 4th grade kids. They just want to run at recess. They don't understand that that's actually hurting you. It's
Right.
not choosing you. So it's about also having open line of communications with your child. If you can be a model for your child now, they will be much more well set up in the future in terms of advocacy. So let them see you do it. Involve them when the time is right. Those are my ideas. The last thing we talk about before we go on is this diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
This is a really good example for any parent just to have in their toolbox, kind of like the 5-inch heel example or whatever example works for your kid. But diversity, equity, inclusion is like an Evite. Getting invited is one thing, diversity. Having the ability to open the Evite on a computer is equity. Like not everybody has access to that computer. And we call that sometimes accessibility. And inclusion is when you get to the party, you're invited. So you want to make sure that your teachers understand that too, because I think that the middle one, the equity, the ability to get there, the ability to participate, is often overlooked. And I think CMT is a really difficult disability for teachers because they don't understand it.
Right.
And they don't see it. And I want to just share with parents, and I think parents will actually, and I think it's a little bit different for you, Estella, because you are affected with CMT, but parents who aren't affected with CMT, who might be married to someone, as I was in the case with CMT, I tell teachers this all the time, and I think it's an important thing to like make sure they don't get it wrong, is like, I didn't actually get it until I had a child with it. I was married to someone with CMT. I could have been the most empathetic person in the world. I loved him dearly, but I didn't really see it as much. I did, like, yeah, I made sure of certain things and I was aware, but I didn't really like fundamentally get it. And I talk about going to concerts with Phil where I would like have him with like wet floors and drunk people. Like it was insane, right? Like, why would I ever have him do that? But I didn't get it, right? I knew it was hard for him to stand that long, but I didn't get it until I saw it through Reagan's eyes. So give the teachers a way of getting out of being wrong and saying like, you're not going to ever get it as well as you should, but as long as you try, that's
exactly. Yeah, the empathy is the main factor.
Empathy, yeah. Okay, so I think that the one-on-one relationship with the teachers is the best part you can have because that's the human relationship. Now we're going to get into like the documented relationship, which is where the teachers have to legally, and the administration of the school has to legally provide you services. I always start with the human part because that's the part that's going to get you the most mileage. And then the second part is where you're going to get your services. So public versus private is a little bit different. When you go to a public school, all the services are provided through the school. And so they're taken out of class, which may or may not be something you want. Whereas at a private school, related services, and by related services, I mean PT, OT, counseling, speech, etc., are provided outside of school hours or in the community. And so when you're in a public school, which I don't know as much about, it is delivered during the school hours. So I know one thing for sure about public school situations that I wanted to say is if your school is in a lottery situation, this is probably, and you can cut this if you want, but this is probably illegal, but it's really important that it's not something to be afraid of to have an IEP. In fact, you could probably get a seat at that school without a lottery as a result because they can't be seen as sending away their kids with disabilities, if that makes sense. They have to provide those services in the school. And if they were to not accept those kids, so sometimes when you're in a lottery situation, you can even be in a better situation if you have an IEP. So I know a lot of parents like to not highlight it in the beginning, so it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world to have an IEP. And in some cases, it can put you up the list, as the case was in New York. So I know we have a global audience here. So in private school, it's a little bit different. Typically, you have to engage the district. And again, in New York City, there was only one district. So where you live and where you go to school are kind of important pieces. I'm finding out in Texas, if those districts are different, there's a bit more of a fight between the districts on who is responsible for delivering the services, and that you have to navigate locally. In New York City, the district was all one. And the way they saw it was that if you were not a student in the public schools, that was like, they didn't have to pay your tuition. They were like happy, but they will give you everything else. They will give you busing, point to point if you need it, not on a general ed bus or a general ed bus. They will give you related services. And so like anything that a public school student would get, a private school student would get, because they like value the fact that they're not having to pay for your education. So you get everything else. I found out when I moved to Texas, not the same. They have something called proportionate share, which is they have special education dollars for non-public school students. And they decide most of those kids need speech. We'll give only speech. And if you don't need speech, you don't get anything. So it's called proportionate share. So be aware of those rules and figure out what district that you're dealing with. But in general, when you deal with a private school, one of the things you should know you have on your side is you have a diagnosis. And so a lot of parents that are fighting for services don't have a diagnosis necessarily. The thing that you are really fighting is that diagnosis is not cognitive. You fight that for Medicaid, you fight that for an IEP. And so the whole idea behind the IEP and Section 504 is that it has to interfere with their ability to access public education. And so everything you do, every letter from a teacher, everything you do has to be in the context of having them fairly, back to that EVITE, equitably be able, the DEI talk we had, be able to equitably access education. And if they are unable to do that because of fatigue or mobility, then it is the school's, the district's responsibility to help them. So it's not just medical, it's the ability to educate them because of their medical condition, if that makes sense. So always think about that. And if you have problems, you should engage a special needs attorney to fight the district that you have. There are oftentimes, depending on where you are, if you find, especially, I know this happens a lot in New York, and not necessarily with CMT, but with cognitive disabilities like ADD and dyslexia, that if the district is not able to provide an adequate education, you can actually sue for them to pay for private school tuition. And so that's when you would involve kind of a special needs attorney to pay for private school tuition in a place that can provide that. So when you think about specialized schools for dyslexia and stuff like that, but just understanding that in the broader context is they have to be able to provide it. So I think we're going to go through the roles of an IEP next, right?
Yeah.
So an IEP is an individualized education program. This is a plan of care, so to speak, based on the needs of a student. This IEP, the difference between an IEP and a 504, we're going to actually hear a video about in a minute, but think of a 504 as kind of like an IEP light. So an IEP, if you want related services like PT, OT, counseling, speech, you need to go up to the level of an IEP. If you want extra time on tests, if you want it to be documented that they have to enter the room from the left instead of the right, like these are the kinds of things that 504s do. And we'll hear the actual difference. There's two different laws that actually determine it. But the understanding the word related services, which is those are the services, PTOT counseling, is part of an IEP, which is literally a plan of care, what we're going to do, what the school is held accountable to by law. And it can include some Section 504 things as well, like accommodations, which we'll talk about. So I think the next one is a much more educated person or me doing a very much more succinct version of what an IEP and a 504 is.
There are many differences between an IEP and a 504 plan. The first and most fundamental is they're governed by different laws. An IEP is governed by a special education law. 504 is governed under a civil rights law. And that makes a difference in what kinds of services and how an IEP plan and 504 plan come together. To qualify for an IEP, you have to have one of 13 specified conditions or disabilities that are written in the law. For example, specific learning disability, which would be something like dyslexia, would be a condition that a child would qualify for an IEP under. Having one of those 13 identified disabilities isn't enough to make sure your child gets an IEP. Whatever is going on with your child, whatever that disability is, also has to affect his performance in the classroom. And that's really important to know, because sometimes parents think that just having a disability qualifies for an IEP, but you also need to make sure that it's making a difference. It has what's called educational impact, adverse impact in the classroom for how your child's learning. For a 504 plan, a child needs to have a disability that is getting in the way of his learning in the general education classroom. The difference isn't that he needs specialized instruction, it's that he needs some changes to get benefit from his education the same way as other kids in that classroom. And so kids who have ADHD often have 504 plans, and what happens is just changes are made to the environment, and those changes are called accommodations. And those changes are made in the general education classroom and don't require specialized instruction. So for example, a child with ADHD may need extra time to work on a test or to get his homework done. So some people are concerned that a 504 plan isn't as good as an IEP. And the truth of the matter is that a 504 plan or an IEP can meet your child's needs. It just depends on how well it's put together. A well-written, well-implemented plan that everybody knows what's going to be happening and in place and is working on it can be very helpful for a child who doesn't need that specialized instruction. As long as there's a lot of follow-through and everybody's checking in to make sure it's working well, a 504 plan can be very helpful for kids in the classroom.
Key takeaways. An IEP is governed by a special education law. A 504 plan is governed by a civil rights law. A 504 plan covers kids with disabilities who don't require specialized instruction.
So one of the things that you notice from the 504 is that an IEP kind of elevates the discussion to needing special ed. And unfortunately, without an IEP, you don't have related services like PT and OT. And this is where the cognitive part comes in, which is really difficult sometimes. And so you always have to address the district. So actually, when I started in the New York City public school system, I applied for kindergarten through the public school system and had her properly assessed by their school psychologist. So even if you're going to private school, you might want to do that because it kind of gets you in the system. If you're going to public school, as you know, you would start with the counselor there. So, and if you're in the EI system already, as I mentioned in the very beginning, it'll be a little bit more of a kind of graduating approach. So depending on when you enter the system, you're going to always deal with the public school district. Noting that when you meet with the public school district, you'll usually have a meeting with a school psychologist, and they will basically learn about your child. They will not have heard of CMT. They will have heard of muscular dystrophy. I always use the term, it's in the family of muscular dystrophy, because they've heard of muscular dystrophy and they know it's super serious. And so I always say that it's a peripheral neuropathy. It doesn't affect the whole body like muscular dystrophy does, but in their head, it level sets what we're talking about. So I think it's really important for them to know it's degenerative. So every day is their best day. And if they don't have these services, then they are unable to perform at their best the next day. So everything has to be in the context of their need for accessing education. And so one of the things that often hurts parents and often hurts teachers is for them to say that they are kind of behind the curve as a result. And so just don't be afraid of it. Oftentimes teachers, we would have them explain that Reagan was below grade level in writing, even though she was a brilliant writer, because she would be able to perform so much better if she wouldn't fatigue so much. So really literally explaining in the same way you do with the teachers what it means to have this disease um, is super important. And I think it's just super important not to shy away from the severity of it in any way. And I think we tend to be frogs in boiling water a little bit, where we're like, nothing to see here. You know, my gait's a little disturbed. I'm a little more tired. Like, go in full throttle with how much it affects your child. Advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And actually try to think about how much it affects them. Like, they are pretty tired. Like, it does. I mean, half the time they're sitting in their chair trying to, like, you just have to really put yourself in your child's shoes in order to advocate for them. Don't forget the counseling part if you want your child to participate in it. I mean, Reagan's kind of annoyed by it actually right now, because the woman's like, how are you in school? And she can't really separate school from, but it'll always be about school, school, school. But social dynamics are really important to the kid, and leverage the counseling to help your kid navigate the social situations. And so don't be afraid to talk about like what those playground examples that I had. And um, you have to, like Reagan had in New York, had 4 hours of PT a week, 1 hour of OT a week, and in addition to 2 hours of counseling a week. It started with one, but I advocated to get to two because she liked her counselor. So you don't even have to use it all, but like advocate for as much as you can. Speaking about the degenerative nature, how today was her best day, how she needs this to maintain muscle strength. Those types of things are really important to advocate for the most. Typically in the beginning, they will try to get you to do like two times a week for 30 minutes or one time a week for 60. Like, you want to get, and as they get older, you'll expand 30 minutes to 45 to 60, because you just don't have time to go to 100 different appointments after school. But knowing that that's on the other side of the fence, they're like managing how many hours they give. And so, and how they give them, whether they're in 30-minute increments or 45-minute increments. So fight for what's necessary for your child, but don't put your child in any of these services that they don't need, because everyone will be upset. Transportation depends on the district. I found out in Texas, they don't provide it, but in New York City, they definitely do. So they provide transportation. If it's one-on-one transportation, they provide that. Not always the best option because it might take longer, but they provide that. So let's talk about accommodations real quick. Accommodations are really important for CMT students too, and they're things you don't think about. Extra time on state tests. That's just actually called extra time on tests, but it gives them extra time on state tests, a distraction-free setting, so they can take a test in a separate room. These are things that are often offered to kids with ADHD and other things, but can also be helpful for CMT students. Extra time on homework. I just learned this one in going through the process in Texas in 7th grade, where the OT brought up, the evaluator brought up showing concept proficiency verbally with less busy work for their writing if they're tired. Like, why do they need to do 17 worksheets of math if they can show proficiency? Move on. So it's those are like called accommodations, meaning like we will accommodate your child to do something different than we expect the other children because of their disability. And that's where kind of the 504 plan ends. Related services, in addition to the ones we've talked about, PT, OT, counseling, those are the ones that I've found the most helpful. But there's also speech if your child's affected. All other, you could advocate for any of these. I really focus on PT, OT, and speech for Reagan, so I can't really speak to a ton of the other ones, but knowing that there are other related services, if they apply to your child, that you could advocate for, then you would just explain why your child needs them. Again, always talking about the fact that it's degenerative is important. Assistive technology happens as they get a little bit older. I found the use of it important. Two things about assistive technology. One, the school district can do a review, an assessment of your child. In the IEP process, they will always do an evaluation with their PT, their OT, and their psychologist anyway. Then in the future renewal process, they will rely on your PT/OT reports to further engage new services going on. And so assistive technology came up for us in about 5th grade, which is like, again, if you're in a private school, they can maybe provide this anyway, and so you don't need it written down. to the extent that you deal with the teachers, maybe you don't need it depending on the technology of your school. But this is an important thing that the school districts can provide. And you ask for an assistive technology evaluation, which is electronic books, voice to text, laptop for notes, iPad. My daughter, they're not allowed to have iPhones or iPads in school. Reagan does, because it's easier for her to take notes on an iPad using the pressure of an Apple Pencil versus writing, the fatigue of writing. So thinking about things that would work for your child. And then you can request an assistive technology evaluation. You can also do this through a hospital, like your doctor can do this through like an OT. We did it at NYU in New York, through an OT PT evaluation through your orthopedic or whatever. They can do an assistive technology review and provide that to the district. The district might want to do another one, but at least you have an idea of what kinds of things are out there for you. And they'll also talk about things you can do in your home modifications, all those kinds of things. But again, these are things that allow the student to do, to work, to produce more equitably accessible, easier. And so just to know that assistive technology is out there. The evaluation process, what to expect. I actually kind of covered a little bit of this already, but number one, you have a diagnosis. This isn't like, I don't know what's going on with my child. This is like, she has a physical disability and this is what she needs. So you need to go in with that confidence. That speaks volumes. It's in the family of muscular dystrophy. Again, like teachers, unless you put it into their words, like 5-inch heels, can't walk, burning feeling, they don't understand it. So they've heard of muscular dystrophy. They haven't heard of CMT. We all need to do a better job of that. But so advocate in a way that they understand. This is like muscular dystrophy. Thank God it's not, fatal. However, it affects the peripheral nerves more than the rest of the body. Start with the umbrella and get more specific, but level set with the umbrella. Once the muscle is gone, the function is almost impossible to recover. So it's very important to keep these kids physically engaged in a way that they can be engaged. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, baseline. Today is her best, most functional day she'll ever have again. These are just words that you can use in the evaluation process. And she needs these services to maintain baseline, to be able to interact with her peers. When you're young, half of education access is social dynamics. Keep that in your head. So their job, an OT's job, is like how they live their work, and their work is to be out and be socially and at school. So that's what an OT does, is how, for us, it's like how you can get to work, occupational therapy, but for them, it's how they can get to school. IDEA requires that a child be assessed in all areas related to their disability. So just know that in this process, they will be evaluated independently by the district. There's advocacy on your part, but at the end of the day, you're obviously only going to get what you need, which is what you need, but they're going to be not prepared to give that to you unless you really fight. So keep making sure that you are an advocate, and knowing that they don't understand what CMT is, you've got to be the educator. And so the IEP team will review all the information. They'll talk to you. They'll talk to Reagan. They'll interview her. They'll look at her. They'll test her. Cognitively will always be part of it. And to identify any related services the child needs, because most of these people are only used to identifying cognitive issues. And so they will have a cognitive test as part of it. And then the goals are written from there. This is like a really weird process that like doesn't matter, but they do, which is like you have to like write every year what the goals were. And then they have to like assess her against those goals to make sure that it's providing value. And they will determine when the service will begin, how often it's provided, and where it will be provided. And then I think one last thing I want to say before we go to these items is, even when you get to the end of the IEP, you get approval for 4 times a week for PT or whatever it is best for your child. They will then give you, in a private school, a contract. And they will say, you'll have to wait for someone to call you. There's this whole game where you're in this system for people to call you to provide you those services because they have a contract with someone. You can go to anyone. You just have to have that person not be able to meet your services. So call them, be like, you can't do Friday? Boom, can't do it. Like there's this like game you have to play in the beginning once you get that contract to actually find the person. So getting like approval for the service and getting the service, number 2 hurdle. And so making sure that you kind of play that game a little bit is important. The last thing I didn't mention actually was a para, which is a person that goes to school with your child. Most CMT kids don't need this. Most CMT kids you don't want another adult in your classroom. It's not really positive for them unless they need it. However, when they have surgeries and they're rehabbing, they can't go to school, they need it. So having that discussion up front about the need for a para as needed so that they understand that there are times when you need to call in a para will be very important to level set. I think we went over a lot. Estelle, I hope we didn't go over time. I'm happy for people to reach out to me. I think you can find my information on the H&F website as well. But there are so many resources online. It's just hard to navigate them. It's very difficult, but each district is so different too. So it's important to start with, is there another disabled kid in your school? Anyway, mentally, cognitively, physically, hook up with that mom, figure out what she's done. Look in the grades ahead of you, look in the grades below you. Don't just look in the world right next to you, because they will have the end. I remember one mom telling me, like, go sit at the district the day that the contracts are released. Don't wait for them to mail them to you. You have to go to the office. You have to sit in the waiting room, and you have to, like, bother them. That's how you get your contract.
Yeah.
That's
Squeaky
literally
wheel.
what I did every year, you know? So you learn the most from other parents around you who are dealing with it. And again, whether it's physical, mental, or both, you can learn from any of those parents who are in the world of dealing with.
Awesome. Yeah. And for anyone looking to learn more and connect with those resources that Brooke was mentioning, I know these are long URLs here, but they will be included in the H&F's virtual booth on school accommodations. So if you head over to the exhibit hall during one of our breaks, these links will be there, and a few more, as well as our accessible college webinar for anyone with older students in high school. Highly recommend that. It's very, very informative, and a lot of great information and resources in that as well, including a free consultation offer with an accessible college counselor. So thank you so much, Brooke, I'm going to stop my share here so you can see each other.
Hey.
So thank you. Yay, there you are. So yeah, thank you so much, Brooke, for sharing your experience. I know we are constantly learning each day, but like you mentioned, it's so important to kind of lean on each other for support and speak with other parents in similar situations and in the CMT community. We are going to be having some speed networking throughout our sessions, and there's going to be open chats. If you haven't yet taken advantage of that, go ahead, connect in the Facebook groups. And if you'd like to reach out to Brooke or someone on our side, please email us as well at info@hnf-cure.org, and we will do our best to help you with resources that way. So thank you again, Brooke, for sharing your time and experience. And
I'm really impressed, by the way, Estella, with what the team has put together here. I'm super excited about the summit.
Thank you.
Super impressed. So good job.
Well, big team effort. So thank you for being part of it. And we'll see you guys in the next session.
Bye. All right, bye.